Welcome to Sundays with Jane Eyre. This is episode 20, Bertha and Jane, covering volume 3, chapter 1, or chapter 27 of Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre. I was a little in doubt. Did I have that right? Yeah, that's it. Chapter 27. I'm Edward G. Pettit of the Rosenbach in Philadelphia, and joining me today as co-hosts are the Ghoul Guides, Dr. Lauren Nixon and Mary Going. Hi, Lauren. Hi, Mary.
Hi.
Hi, it's nice to be back.
Good. It's always good to have you back. Thank you. Lauren, I love the new buns up here, the Princess Leia.
Thank you.
That's awesome. First, I thought you were wearing a little hat with ears or something, and then I realized, fun. I like that.
I mean, I wouldn't put it past me.
Good. Well, welcome also to all of our erudite Brontosaurs and Airheads. If you're new to the show, just a note on our format. If you're watching live on Zoom, and there are many of you today, the chat is for you to talk to each other. Remember to set your chat to everyone as well. I'm talking to Mary's parents especially. They always have it on hosts and panelists, and they tweet, they chat things. I want everybody to see it. But if you have a question for us, put it in the Q&A, and we'll do our best to hit as many of them as possible today. We're also streaming live on YouTube, and I encourage everyone to like and subscribe. Go to YouTube and like and subscribe to the channel, like these shows. Leave a comment. If you leave a comment or ask a question on YouTube, I won't get to it until after the show. And that's it. So we're ready to start. I'm ready to get right going. Yes. Happy Valentine's Day Eve to everybody, as I just saw in the chat. It's very nice. These are the perfect chapters for the anti-Valentine's Day celebrations that happen with some people. It's also snowing today. I have this real nice view out my window here with the snow coming down. So I've got good weather for this today. How's it out there for you guys today? I mean, Lauren and Mary, the audience, because they can't, respond.
It's been a bit rainy here, but we've not had any snow. I don't know if you had any snow, Lauren.
No, it's just kind of sleety and grim.
We've had a few snowfalls this year already. It's really nice to get that. So, and today's also a big holiday. We're broadcasting today. It's Super Bowl Sunday. So this is, it's nice to get this done in the afternoon, that everybody can go to their Super Bowl parties, later. In America, for you, it would be very much later. So I guess Super Bowl starts at like 1:30 in the morning for you. So
yeah, I did wonder why there are all those owls on my Twitter, but it's that kind of parallel thing of celebrating the superb owl. So I gathered that it must be the Super Bowl.
I've never heard that joke. That's greit's
Have you not? It's a very online thing, but it happens every year. I'm like, why is there loads of owls on my Twitter? Oh, okay. Super Bowl.
That's it. That sounds like a Harry Potter thing, right? Is that I don't know, maybe the origin of that? I don't know.
I was just watching What We Do in the Shadows, the TV series, and they have a whole episode where the vampires go to a Super Bowl party, but they think it's a dedication for the superb owl and
superb owl.
Superb owl. Yeah.
I don't know that one. Yeah. I didn't watch all that series. I only watched most of the first season, and I never got back to it. So
it's really good. It's really good. Very funny.
There was a time and even like not that long ago, when you could watch every supernatural monster kind of show that was available. And now it's nearly impossible. There are so many across all platforms that you can't do that anymore. So, well, we're not going to talk about monsters today, or are we, Rochester? But we are going to talk about Jane Eyre, and it's a huge chapter, so we should get right to it. I want to get your take before we hit this chapter, though, on the last chapter, on the wedding and the interruption that we had, and then Rochester admits that he is married, and that's the strange mystery going on in the house that Jane can't figure out, and he takes them all up, and they meet Bertha, and then Jane is finally overcome at the end after this whole experience at the end of the chapter. But as we'll talk more about Bertha today, let me just get your take on the revelation of her in the last chapter, and how she's described and all of that. Who wants to go?
This is one of the like, not conflicting necessarily, because I think as like contemporary scholars we all kind of agree, but I think this is, you know, the description of Bertha in this moment in the novel is the moment that kind of brings maybe the fantasy elements of reading Jane Eyre, that there is an element of reading this as like a romance text. This is the moment where it brings it all crashing down, that like, you know, there is no supernatural element, there is no goings on, but the thing that is happening is actually, you know, it's really horrific. And the difference here is it's not something that the villain has done, you know, it's not a dead body, it's not it's not someone's mother who's been, you know, because this is kind of like, so in the Sicilian Romance by Anne Radcliffe, the mother is kept prisoner in a cave beneath the house. So it's not the first time that we have had, like, you know, men locking their wives away from the world. Like, this is a Gothic trope by this point, but the post-colonial aspects of the moment and the way that he talks about Bertha's insanity and her humanity, you know, it's a very, like, I think if you were reading this novel under any illusions, this is the moment that those kind of get stripped away from you, and you have that kind of, oh my God, okay. Mm-hmm. And especially if you're reading it thinking it's a Gothic novel, because it is a Gothic novel, but the conventions that you might be expecting versus what you get, like, it's still very much in keeping, but it kind of subverts it, particularly with the marriage. You have a lot of heroines in the 18th century who are tricked or nearly tricked into these false marriages and sham marriages with men who are already married, or, you know, have lied or whatever it is, and it usually ends in, if they do get married, it usually ends in death, you know, or ruin, and you do have this massive dilemma. I'd be interested actually to kind of see what everybody in the chat thought about it, because I find, particularly when I've taught Jane Eyre in the past, that actually a lot of students are conflicted about the scenes here and about how you're supposed to respond, and whether or not you're supposed to, you know, be sympathetic or be angry or be like horrified, or, you know, Jane is all of those things at the same time. Yeah, I think this is a really important moment.
I just, before the show started today, I was talking with my my daughter Lulu, who edits the credits for the show. About, because she just finished it again for the second time. She read it last year, but she's actually just read it for school now. And her difference, and I was trying to get her to be on the show today, but then she had to go babysit, so she can't be here. But she said she said, wow, reading it the second time really opened her eyes up about Rochester's behavior the whole time. And not that we weren't talking about it all when she read it the first time, but it really opened up for her this time, and she really, you know, could see things that you know, she was just, and the whole, and the especially the chapter we're going to talk about today, she was just furious over reading that again the second time. But then we won't get him today, but next week. Then we meet St. John, and then it's funny because then she meets St. John Rivers, and she's like, all right, maybe Rochester's not so bad, but we'll get to that next week. Mary, what about Bertha and the way Rochester introduces her, and the way he, you know, well, and the things that happened last chapter?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think also the chapter before that as well, with the, you know, Bertha creeping in and the dreams and everything, that's all, these kinds of three chapters together are the kind of like the big moments, the kind of the night before the storm, and then the wedding, and then the kind of the night after. So they're really interesting. Also, just to focus in on Rochester and what he's doing, how he, you know, explains away. He knows it's Bertha, who is the one that destroys the veil, but he just pretends and explains away and lies, and then
Grace Poole.
Exactly a convenient kind of explanation or excuse. And then you get the last chapter with the wedding, and then well, the not wedding, because it doesn't really happen, and he drags Jane and everyone else up to the attic and introduces them to Bertha. And I think you were discussing, he talks about Jane in, look at her, this is what I wanted, would you not do this? And it's quite aggressive in his kind of the way that he is finally revealing to everyone, yes, I'm married, here she is, and then look at Jane, and inviting in that moment a kind of comparison between the two women. And then in this chapter, I think it's really interesting to compare it to his duplicity throughout the text, his kind of anger and kind of aggression in the previous chapter, and those things. And what I think in this chapter, there's just so much manipulation. And if this was my friend, if Jane were my friend telling me about this, I would just be like, that's a red flag, that's a red flag, that's a red flag, you need to leave. I think it's just a really interesting kind of build up, and Charlotte Bronte does it so well, because this is the end of volume 2, the start of volume 3, so there's so much that's kind of that you've been through already with Jane. And I think that's what's interesting about Bertha, and we'll talk about this more in this chapter, but the idea that she's always been there, essentially. She is a ghost. She's been haunting Thornfield Hall and also the narrative, but she's not a ghost. And I think Rochester has tried to pretend that she's dead in one way or another, that she is a ghost, but actually, if you look at her descriptions, they're quite physical, and I think her body and her physicalness kind of refuses to be turned into a ghost. It's almost like she declares her presence even before this moment. It's like she's saying, I'm here, which I just think it's really interesting, and I'd be interested to see what other people think about the kind of progression and this kind of revelation as well.
And that scene where he's literally wrestling her is, that's the psychological dilemma for him all this time that is finally revealed. That is what he has been wrestling with the whole time in his mind, and trying to, and having her there too is, well, we'll hit that later, because that's mentioned later in this chapter. Like, why does he even do this? Well, he finally will explain himself. We'll see if that is him, if that's how we accept that, and how that fits in the novel, and what that says about him and about this entire story. Well, the end of that chapter, Jane is finally, and we hit this at the end of of the last show too, that she finally remembers, like, oh, well, she says, she finally has a remembrance of God. Maybe I should pray. Maybe I should look elsewhere and find something that I can rely on to, give me strength, hope to deal with this situation. But actually then she doesn't. And it says, it was near, and as I had lifted no petition to heaven to avert it, that, like, she kind of doesn't, I had neither joined my hands nor bent my knees nor moved my lips before she could do it. Then she's overwhelmed by this torrent, she describes it in this very, again, biblical language, and then there's a quotation, I think it's from the Psalms, is that the waters came into my soul? Is it the Psalms? Am I misremembering? I don't know, but it's a direct biblical reference, but in this instance, it's not one of hope for her. It is one of finally being overwhelmed. The floods overflowed me, and she kind of collapses finally after all this, after trying to be so Jane and mechanically take off my my wedding dress and lie down, and I'm not going to cry, and I'm just going to think about this and deal with my emotions and take care of everything. She's finally overcome, as as anybody would be. Not a sign of weakness, and that's one of the things I find so one of the things I like so much about this novel is that Jane doesn't really have moments of she's not the weak character that is too often portrayed in these heroines. So she is strong frequently, and then obviously in moments like this where she should be overcome, it takes a bit to knock her down. Chapter 27. I'm calling today's episode Bertha and Jane. I was calling it Bertha and Rochester and Jane, but then I thought, yeah, let's just call it Bertha and Jane.
It doesn't need to be in it.
There you go. She finally gets up later in the afternoon. Sometime in the afternoon, I raised my head and very Janey, what am I to do? Okay, now what's the plan? Let me figure this out. Let me logically figure what's the next step that I have to take. And it's immediately to leave Thornfield at once. That I am not Edward Rochester's bride is the least part of my woe. That she's awakened out of most glorious dreams, found them all void and vain. It's a horror I could bear a master, but that I must leave him decidedly, instantly, entirely is intolerable. I cannot do it. So I have to leave, but oh no, I can't leave. Very honest reaction from her, isn't it?
Yeah, I think, to be honest, this is one of the things that frustrated me as a teenager rereading it, but as an adult, I think is such a wonderfully raw depiction of human emotion, because this is very much a novel where the heroine doesn't behave in the idealistic way. It's difficult sometimes to get behind Jane because you want, and I think I often see a lot of Bronte and Atwood. I think I've said this before, because Atwood's heroines are they're very difficult sometimes to root for because they're painfully real. And I think Jane's acknowledgement that, she knows that she should leave. She knows that it's terrible. She understands all that, but there's that temptation to stay. Who would know? Well, what if we just do, and it's my life, and these are the things I want, and I know that I'm not doing anything terrible. There is that difficulty and that desire, and I think that is something we don't often like to talk about, because it is very real, and we don't like to acknowledge that about ourselves. And I think this is one of those moments where Bronte forces you to think about yourself and what you would do, because it's so easy to be like, well, I would go straight away, but that it's not that simple to just cut and run. And that it's actually really difficult to abandon those emotions, and that in the immediate aftermath of trauma and crisis and revelation, you kind of, well, we can make it work. We can figure this out. It will be fine. And eventually you come to that horrible, conclusion of actually, no, it won't work. It's not possible. And I think this is a really great moment where Jane lifts the veil, so to speak, on that kind of that vulnerable rawness and that unpleasantness of that feeling, and that's something that so many of us will go through.
Mary, would you read that next paragraph, but then a voice within me?
Yeah. But then a voice within me averred that I could do it, and foretold that I should do it. I wrestled with my own resolution. I wanted to be weak, that I might avoid the awful passage of further suffering I saw laid out for me. And conscience turned tyrant, held passion by the throat, told her tauntingly she had yet but dipped her dainty foot in the slough, and swore that with the arm of iron he would thrust her down to unsounded depths of agony. Which is really interesting that she's having this kind of inner conflict, and that there seems to be a voice that is detached from her yet also connected to her. And I guess the idea that where does that, where do these voices come, and the commands telling her to go? Is it herself? Is it her conscience, or is it something perhaps higher warning her that this is what you should do? And I think the idea that, this awful passage of further suffering, and the idea that, suffering, particularly from a kind of Christian perspective, suffering is something that everyone has to go through. And that, especially if you are thinking about, as Jane is often thinking about, the afterlife, and the reward in there, and wanting to avoid particularly, hell, that suffering in this life will be worth it. But I think that conflict, like Lauren said, it's interesting because it's showing you how hard it is, and I think it makes you see Jane as stronger, because it is so difficult for her to leave, especially knowing that, you know, this voice has foretold her that it's not going to be easy to leave, and then on the other side, that's also not going to be easy. It's going to be a bit bad still for a while, and it might be tempting and comforting to stay here where you're safe, you know, where you've made a home, but you need to go through all this pain. It's a really interesting kind of opening as well for a volume.
I think one of the things as well that I think about this, like when you think about, you know, the corpus of literature and the canon, and like, where does this novel fall and what does it do? You've had so many instances up until now that, you know, present providence and trusting God and following God's path as something that is difficult, but ultimately not that difficult, because, you know, of course it's righteous, of course it's the thing to do. And you know, we've said before, this is a novel that often brings to mind Pamela, both consciously and unconsciously. And I think
a couple Pamela notes for later. Go ahead.
Yeah, like this is so different to what Pamela experiences, because Pamela makes difficult choices, not because she's strong, but because she believes, you know, and she's like, well, I'll be fine, because if this is what God wants for me, then I'll be fine. Jane has that more kind of like realistic kind of earthly faith, where yes, she has these very in-depth, very, you know, theological, you know, debates within herself essentially. But it's also really interesting because she kind of, the way that Jane presents her faith is also very easy for an increasingly secular world to understand, because that idea, like Mary just said, of, you know, you bear hardship for glory in the afterlife, or for, you know, safety in the afterlife. There's also this increasing thing of, particularly in the kind of 1840s and 1850s, of if you struggle now, you will succeed later. And that is you know, difficulty during study, difficulty during youth, difficulty at war, whatever it might be, will bring felicity later on. And I think you get that kind of, this isn't just a case of step out into the wilderness, everything will be fine because you're doing the right thing in the eyes of God. This is step out in the wilderness because God or no God, this is the moral right. This is what you believe to be true. And you know, both from a religious and a real, like, reality, this is what you're going to have to face perspective. This is not going to bring you long-term, you know, prosperity. And I think it's really fascinating how that diverts from texts like Pamela, that kind of place the strength in the faith connection. And it gives the faith, the strength to Jane. You know, she is a strong individual. Her faith is part of her strength, but also her mind, her resolve. You know, this is all part of Jane as an individual. And that shift from, you know, providence to individuality, and obviously Jane rebels against that very much when she's younger. You see it really clearly here. But now, yeah, like, I think it's really interesting when you think about the development.
And next she hits this, you know, from the Beatitudes, but she hits, you know, the fierce part of the Beatitudes, not the, you know, blessed are the you know, the peacemakers. It's, but this
is one of my favorite Bible passages.
There you go. Well, read it then. Go ahead, read that.
So she's saying, let me be torn away. No, you shall tear yourself away. None shall help you. You shall yourself pluck out your right eye, yourself cut off your right hand. Your heart shall be the victim, and you the priest to transfix it. So this is a kind of paraphrase, a kind of version of Matthew 5:27-30. And essentially, the reason that I like it is because in the original passage, there's a gender and a power dynamic. The kind of religious leaders, the Pharisees of the time, came to Jesus and said, what shall we do if we see a beautiful woman? And Jesus says, well, if your eyes are causing you to lust, then pluck them out. And goes on in that kind of way, like whatever is causing you to sin, that's on you, and you shouldn't punish the kind of object of your gaze. It's your eyes that are the kind of the objects that are causing you to sin. So essentially what Jane is doing here is she's putting herself in that position of someone who is lustful, who is gazing on something and who wants something. And it's not only saying that this is wrong and it's me that needs to kind of adjust my behavior, but that I am the only one that can do that. It's not someone's not going to come along and pluck out my eyes. I need to do that for myself. So it's very much that kind of individuality, but rooted in a specific kind of biblical faith. I mean, I don't know if what anyone else thinks about this passage, but
she's quite fierce about it too, and doing that, and I want to put a pin in this for a little later too, because when it's interesting that Rochester usually in Jane's passionate moments here, well, in this one in particular, she's using all this biblical language and that's what she's going to for. He usually does the whole fairy story kind of thing when he gets all passionate about stuff, but later he does then throw out these biblical references, but it's so different from Jane. So I want to put a pin in that and then make sure later we compare what Rochester uses from the Bible to describe his situation compared to how Jane does that here. She also then in the next paragraph, now we've had all this biblical language. Now we get all the Gothic language, the terror struck at the solitude with so ruthless a judge haunted. I have been shut up here. No message had been sent to ask how I was or invite me to come down. And now we're into the strange pang and the kind of more the Gothic element of the novel again. And then she finally goes to leave her room and nobody's come for me. And she goes out of the room and I fell but I didn't fall all the way. Rochester was there sitting outside her room the whole time, which I don't know how to interpret as well. And I'm sure people in the past, especially, have interpreted that it's so romantic. He waited out there for her, or it's just still creepy. Because
it always post Twilight. I know that this is one of the novels that Stephanie Meyer quotes, and I'm like, did she read this and go, "Oh, that's so romantic," and then be like,
"Bet you she did."
You should watch her sleeping. That's the height of romance.
Yeah.
Because it is one of those moments.
This bit is so selfish because she says, Mrs. Fairfax, no one has come to check on her. It's because he's literally been like sleeping outside her door, and she's hungry and she's thirsty, but he's not there with food or with water, and he doesn't think to say, how are you, can I get you anything, what do you need? His first kind of like this first paragraph, there's just so much I and so much me. And
what is it about? It's about what she's been doing, right? Yeah.
You shut yourself up and grieve alone. I would rather you had come. And he expects and wants her to react to him in a certain way, and to have all of these feelings and responses and actions towards him, and just not even thinking about what she wants or what she needs, whether it's on an emotional level or just on a purely kind of like, here's some water. I just, again, like Lauren said, I don't understand how this, if anyone is on team not Rochester, this is exactly the bit that the moment in the book where you should be like, okay, yeah, no, not this guy.
Yeah, he's like, why weren't you crying? That's your response.
And this moment is really interesting because what he actually says is like almost a translation of a speech that Valancourt gives to Emily in The Mysteries of Udolpho, where they've been separated, all this stuff's happened, and Valancourt like is kind of like, you haven't cried, you are not distraught, I have been, I can't live without you, and how can you be so unfeeling? you know, and he gives her this speech about his emotion, and she is forced to, you know, curb hers and be calm to calm him down, and she's denied her, you know, grief, her sadness, her dismay, because she is not presenting in the way that he feels that she should be presenting. And you know, I don't know if Bronte read Radcliffe. I strongly suspect that she did. But you know, Radcliffe was such a major player that you see speeches like that. You know, we see translations of Radcliffe, and I say translations because they are like reimaginations, even in authors that didn't read her because of that kind of cultural significance. But that moment there that Mary's, you know, when he says to her, like, what does he say? It's like, oh, I thought that you would, yeah, I see a white cheek and a faded eye, but no trace of tears. Like, you know, it's kind of like, I want you to be performatively grief-stricken and sad and angry, because then I can, you know, I've been telling you I'm a bad person this entire time, and if you respond in this way, then I can actually feel better about it, because I'm telling myself I'm a bad person, and that, you know, it's almost like that allows him to not take responsibility for it. And that's not how Jane is as a human being. And it also, again, hints to that lack of understanding, that lack of deserving. But this...
All right, well, we got it. The next part that we have to hit, because then he's right away saying, I never meant to wound you thus. Will you ever forgive me? Reader, and she's I forgave him at the moment and on the spot. And she's bringing us into that too. She's, you know, like, hey, everybody, you know, she's directly addressing the reader. We're brought into that scene. And she has reasons, the deep remorse in his eye, true pity in his tone. And then the one that I can't quite interpret, the manly energy of his manner. Unchanged love in his whole look and man, yet not in words, but outwardly, only at my heart's core, I forgive him everything. But that remorse, pity, and manly energy.
So manly energy is this it's referring to this concept that comes out of the rise of sensibility. So post the rake, so post Restoration, that comes out of this period of kind of the 1740s, 1750s, in line with Enlightenment, that is all about gentlemanliness being not so much about politeness and appearance, because that's foppish, and foppish isn't manly because it's too pleasing, but about a sense of duty and about responsibility and all of these things. So when we see things like manly energy or like manly fortitude at this period, kind of what it's referring to is this kind of like this recognition that that manliness is inherently flawed, masculinity is inherently flawed, because to be masculine and remain masculine, you must have an element of masculine passion, because if you become too soft, then you become a fop or a dandy, and you know, can't be having that. Like, no, that's not good. So there's this kind of element, and this is where the complication with the Bertha thing comes from, and we'll get this in a minute. I think she's kind of foreshadowing what he's about to say about why he has done what he's done and the situation that he's in, because there's an element here of a young man being manipulated by a situation, trying to take responsibility for it and doing the wrong thing. So this idea of manly energy is this kind of acknowledgement from Jane that he is still, in her eyes, to an extent, extremely masculine in a positive way, because he is trying. He's done it wrong, you know, he's horrifically effed it up, but there's this kind of, you know, recognition, and you know, part of it is he's incredibly hot, like she finds him very attractive, he's very intelligent, but it's that idea of the pull, that it's kind of like a character like Colonel Brandon in Sense and Sensibility, a man who is knows that he's done, you know, knows that he's made mad choices or made mistakes, but is trying to own them in the best way that he can, or the best way that he understands how. So it's this kind of weird recognition that masculinity is faulty, but that it's about the trying and the value and things like that. And there's this element of the internal conflict that makes up an idea of masculinity. And I think that is what she is referring to, particularly because of what Rochester says next, because she says, reader, I forgave him. So this is one of those moments where Jane as narrator is reflecting backwards. And often when she does that, what is about to happen, the things she says in those passages, sets you up for it. So I think the intention is to set you up for what he's about to tell her. Of course, the important thing is she says, not in words, not outwardly, but in my heart, that acknowledgement that she forgives him straight away, but forgiveness doesn't mean that something's right. Forgiveness doesn't mean, and obviously there's an element here of what does forgiveness mean in a Christian sense. But yeah, I think that is the manliness that she is referring to, that there's such a sincerity, because it's that idea of duty and the weight of duty, of being a father, a brother, a husband, a landowner, or whatever it might be, that he's attempted to fulfill his role that he never expected as, Mr. Rochester of Thornfield Hall. Doesn't make it right. But I think that's what is happening here.
Then he I am a scoundrel, Jane, and yes, sir. And again, we have those things here. I think I talked about this last week, maybe, like he constantly uses her name. I know he also has all the diminutives, but she's always Jane. And that Clara Callahan pointed out to me last week, though, but he's always sir. And I was like, oh, that's like, I was thinking she never uses his name. She's like, that's because he's always sir. Yes. So again, but that also denotes here, like that's the recognition that the relationship hasn't changed. And that's what she's trying to get across to him too. You're now my master again, now I'm the governess. But then she has the great, reply to, I cannot, I'm tired and sick. I want some water. Like that's a Janian reply. Like he's trying to get her to open up. Can we talk? Can we talk about this? And she's like, can I have some water? Jane's very matter of fact, realistic about like, let's just, take care of what we need to take care of first before we talk about this. And then, because they're still up in the hallway, for goodness sake, like he's like laying all this into her, like outside of her door, trying to get her to like, this is the big moment. And
she's like half starved and dehydrated.
Yeah. And then he carries her downstairs. And he put the wine to my lips. So then he's suddenly this, he's, maybe he's more Willoughby carrying Marianne home in the rain, but that it's a very dramatic moment that is easy to, I think, especially the visual of it, to interpret it as very romantic and loving. Here he is picking her up. He's helping her when she is, in a moment of weakness and trying to help her, but it's so complicated with the way he behaves towards her. He's, but we get her thoughts again. She's still not talking. Like, right? If I could go out of life now without too sharp a pang, it would be well for me. I then should have to make. I should not have to make the effort of cracking my heartstrings and rending them from among Mr. Rochester's. I must leave him. It appears I do not want to leave him. I cannot leave him. Again, this honesty of her dilemma here, I really find moving, and it reminds me, especially after 19 weeks or less than that, because when we first meet him, of kind of Rochester bashing that we do, that Jane's completely in love with him, that my perspective of Rochester is not Jane's perspective of Rochester, and I have to remind myself of that I don't see him as Bronte has cast Jane as seeing him. And this is but Jane reminds us that that is what's going on here. And then he just like you won't kiss the husband of Bertha Mason, and then she's very real about that. There's neither room nor claim for me, sir. And he'll go on this long explanation that we'll talk about, but he's still trying to convince not just himself but everyone else that I'm not married. He said that to himself so many times that he believes it. And Jane will have none of that, right? She's, you're married, that's it. And that's kind of, I almost think that was his biggest mistake in trying to get Jane to stay, in insisting that something was that he knows isn't, and she knows isn't, that maybe that in the end is the thing that has tipped the scale for her.
I think you see that in this next bit, that when she says, all has changed about me, I will not be Adele's governess, this won't happen. And he says, yeah, she's going to go to school, we're going to go to France, we're going to live together, it's absolutely fine. And I think not only that this kind of plan of his takes her agency, it takes her entirely into his power in a very different way. But then when, just to jump ahead a little bit, when he says to her, I'll shut Thornfield up, I'll give Mrs. Poole 200 years to live here with my wife, as you term that fearful hag. And then he says again, like in the italics, like when my wife is prompted by her familiar to burn people in their beds at night, to stab them, to bite their flesh from their bones, and so on. And she interrupts him and she's like, you're cruel. This is not okay. Like that person, this woman, she, why is this her fault? Why is she a monster? Why is she terrible? She's a human being and she's your wife. And it's that moment when I think that you realize as the reader that he does not understand that she sees this situation entirely differently to him, that she's sympathetic. That's why she forgives him. She's sympathetic that he is in this situation. But what she can't abhor is the way that he speaks about Bertha and the way that he perceives Bertha. Yeah. And I think that's the thing that he completely misjudges. And the fact that it's also not only that she speaks out against him, but that she interrupts him. It's explicit, like, I interrupted him, calls him cruel, says it's intolerable the way that he speaks about her. And I think that's the moment where you see this split and you realize that Bertha's existence is not so much the issue as Rochester's behavior towards Bertha, as being part of the reason why Jane has, part of the main reason why she has to leave. Mm-hmm. And I wonder, if he spoke about Bertha differently, if he, would it make, it's almost like it resolves Jane, it helps Jane make the difficult decision. And I think that's always something we should keep in mind when we think about Bertha. And we talk about Bertha, and I mean, I'll kind of throw it over to Mary because we both love this, but that's one of the reasons I think why White Grass AC is such a fantastic novel, because it reminds us of the significance of Bertha in this text.
I think as well, before we do get to Bertha, I think it just shows how he's misjudged how important religion and faith is to Jane as well. So she says, to go back again, sorry. I remembered caresses were now forbidden. And it's that idea, it's not just that this is bad, but this is a transgression. He is married, and therefore she cannot in any way consider him as a romantic or marital partner, because that would be to transgress against God. And that for her is such a big thing. And he can talk all he wants about, building castles in the sky, about going away with her as his mistress. But for her to do that would to transgress against God in a way that she would never, ever do. And then I think, you know, that his description, you won't kiss the husband of Bertha Mason. And we can get into this later as well. But here you have the kind of racial anxieties about contamination. And part of his fears about Bertha and why he's concealed everything for so long is because when you marry someone, it's a covenant between God, and it's also a union. The woman becomes subsumed into her husband and becomes his property, but also the husband inherits like the kind of familial connections of the wife. And again, we can go into this in a lot more detail about Bertha, and I think, yeah, why Tagassasi is such a great novel to kind of unpick some of the kind of post-colonial and colonial issues that are here, and the anxieties. But the idea that he is married to a mad woman, and also a mad woman who is potentially not white, and therefore it's not just that he's married and that to kiss him is a transgression, but he thinks you don't want to kiss the husband of Bertha Mason because any husband of Bertha Mason is therefore also contaminated. But good. Yeah.
No, that's a great point. And when we're going to get into Bertha in just a minute, and people are asking about divorce in the chat too, and I want to address that too. We'll get to that in just a minute. It's all my notes to talk about today. But first, I just want to say at our mid-break point to everyone that we bring Sundays with Jane Eyre to you for free. So if you'd like to support the Rosenbach through donation, you can do so at our website. And since this novel was published in 1847, we're asking for donations of $18.47 to support the show. Donations directly go toward keeping the show free and accessible to everyone. And I want to thank people who have donated in the past week: Eileen K in Philadelphia, Sophie G in Philadelphia, Alice F in Audubon, PA, and Holly W in Birmingham, Alabama. And you could also become a member of the Rosenbach. And 3 people became members this week. And I love this, that nobody was from Philly. Mary L from Thousand Oaks, California, Helen S from Kingsport, Tennessee, and Molly H from Berkeley, California. Members of the Rosenbach get free and exclusive access to some programs. Plus 10% off of any of our reading courses, 50% off of any Rosenbach paid programs. Lots of great programs and courses coming up. You can see them all on our website. There's also Sundays with Jane Eyre merchandise mugs that I'm drinking my tea out of today with our fantastic logo on it, t-shirts and stickers that you can buy online at the Rosenbach website. We have an official bookseller for Sundays with Jane Eyre too, a novel ID on Passyunk, where you can buy editions of Jane Eyre and books by authors featured on the show. And a couple upcoming co-hosts for the rest of February. Dr. Kathleen Hudson comes back next week. I can't wait to have her on again. And she's also teaching a great Sense and Sensibility course. We just met for the first time last week. It's sold out. It's really nice. Yeah, but it's, boy, what a treat she's been. Thank you, Mary Lauren, for throwing her in the Rosenbach's orbit. And also on fabulous. Yeah. And February 27th, we have Rowan Coleman, who's going to be on the show. And she writes the Bronte Mystery Series under the name Bella Ellis. So I'm really looking forward to have her here too. But let's get back to this book. For so much going on in it that we're not going to get to talk about all of it, but we'll talk about as much of it as we can. His language here as he's talking to her, and this is, when he's, Adele must have a new governess, she says, and he says, Adele will go to school. And then he's got this Gothic language, Thornfield Hall, in a cursed place with a fiend. It's haunted, a curse again. About Bertha that he's talking about, but this is one of those moments where the biblical language he uses, this tent of Achan, or is it Achan? I'm not even sure how to pronounce that, which refers to an Old Testament story in which it's a sinner who is taking all this stuff and then is like, and then everyone stones him and his family to death for doing this, and this is how Rochester's using the Bible. It is to show how other people, I suffer from other people by the things that I do. Jane uses biblical language about how she is going to suffer herself and she needs to pluck out her own eye. He doesn't use that kind of language there. Did I get that story right about the Ten of Achan?
Yeah. And I think just the source as well, it coming from, I think it's is it Joshua, or is it about Joshua? I forget. No, it's Joshua, which is a book in the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament. But notably, a lot of Jane's kind of biblical allusions come from the Gospels, specifically Matthew. So the bit that she quoted earlier about plucking your own eyes out, that comes from Matthew, which is one of the Gospels telling the teachings of Jesus, but also Psalms as well, which it isn't as violent as this, but I think it's interesting that he's not necessarily as rooted as she is in a specific kind of Jesus orientated kind of.
She's quoting New Testament. He's quoting the Hebrew Bible. Well, let's get to Bertha in more in detail, because now he talks about his plans would not permit me to remove the maniac elsewhere, though I possess an old house, Ferndene Manor, even more retired and hidden than this, where I could have lodged her safely enough, had not a scruple about the unhealthiness of the situation in the heart of a wood made my conscience recoil from the arrangement. Probably those damp walls would soon have eased me of her charge, and mine is not tendency to indirect assassination. That doesn't sound real, like a real excuse to me not to send it. It seems like, boy, you really could. Well, what he's basically saying is, I could have kept her a secret from you if I had put her in Ferndene Manor. That's not the point here, Rochester. The point is, you did lock her up and keep her, in a windowless secret room, sometimes restrained. That's real healthy. But that's, like, the reason he has her in Thornfield, I think, is a great moment of psychological insight for Charlotte Bronte too, in that he needs to keep that, what he thinks is his sin, the thing that is, makes him unworthy. He needs to keep it near him. He needs to keep his wife there in the house for, because that's how he is with his conscience.
He has a whole other manner. She could have been there on, not on her own, but with, people, attendants looking after her. She could have had the whole run of the manor. She could, including, I'm assuming, grounds. So she could have been outside. Might not have been the greatest for her, but definitely better than being in like a kind of dark attic room. But his point is that he wants to keep her a secret, and he wants to be in control of that secret. So ultimately, Bertha is the one who suffers, because if she were in that manner, then people would talk more. And I think you have already discussed that he encourages all of the kind of gossip around Bertha. Is she his sister, or all of that kind of stuff? So there's definitely gossip around Thornfield Hall anyway, but there'd definitely be more if more people could see her. That the whole idea of her being in an attic with no windows it's two things. A, she can't see outside and she doesn't have regular access to the sun, but also people can't see in. And I just think it's just so sad. It makes you feel sad for Bertha, that because his wants and needs are met, that hers aren't.
That's such a good point as well, about wants and needs, because her being locked in the attic of Thornfield, which is the seat, it's the family seat, that's the main house, that's the main estate, that is their family, like, ancestral home. It's such a perversion of her status as the wife of Mr. Rochester. She has the right to live in the ancestral home as mistress of it, but instead she is locked in the attic of it. And there's this kind of like double aspect to her being in the attic, in the highest point of the house, being completely without agency. And one thing that I think you look at differently when you read this novel after reading Wide Sargasso Sea, but even after reading something like Rebecca, you start to then consider the sexual aspects of this. Why is she in the house? Why does he come back to the house? He could choose to live in one of the other manors and say that he prefers it for, shooting or sport. He could make that choice. And one of the things that Rhys does in Sargasso Sea is amplify the suggestion of the sexual nature. And we get that in a minute when he talks about Bertha and when he meets Bertha and is married to her. But there is that kind of implicit suggestion that, well, when he brought her back, when they first come back here, we don't know that. And he does explain a little bit in a minute, but there's all of this time, there's all of this space that kind of goes unsaid. And I think you have that question, and you have that concern. And I think it's intentionally meant to give that doubling effect of what it means to be a wife. To what extent Bronte considers that in terms of the physicality of the relationship, as well as the legality, the morality, emotionality, and so forth. But it gives that moment of, she has no agency, he has complete agency. Her situation fulfills his wants and desires. To what extent does that go to? And I think that there's a definite discomfort in that moment. Why is he so visceral?
Yeah.
And I think particularly in this next bit, when he talks about, when he says, do you think I would not love you if you were mad? And he's trying to convince her that that's not the reason that he hates Bertha. That really then complicates his reasons for keeping her in the house.
When Charlotte Brownie herself commented on how she, cast Bertha as mad, one of her letters to William Smith Williams, who was the reader for Smith Elder, who kind of discovered her, read her book first and wanted it published. She wrote a letter to him after it was published that she agreed that the character of Bertha is shocking. And then she writes, there is a phase of insanity which may be called moral madness, in which all that is good or even human seems to disappear from the mind and a fiend nature replaces it. The sole aim and desire of the being thus possessed is to exasperate, to molest, to destroy, and preternatural ingenuity and energy are often exercised to that dreadful end. So that's how she saw Bertha and as she was casting her. But then she continues and she writes, it is true that profound pity ought to be the only sentiment elicited by the view of such degradation. And equally true is it that I have not sufficiently dwelt on that feeling. I have erred in making horror too predominant. Mrs. Rochester indeed lived a sinful life before she was insane, but sin is itself a species of insanity. The truly good behold and compassionate it as such. That it's interesting that even after, other people had commented on it and she thought about it herself, she realized, I should have, because Jane calls Rochester out on this, but even Bronte herself realized, maybe I shouldn't have created her such an animal and kind of almost let Rochester justify it in the way that he did.
I mean, Bertha doesn't speak in this text, and that's why texts like Wide Sargasso Sea are really interesting, because they allow and enable Bertha or Antoinette. What's her name? Antoinette.
She's called Antoinette.
She's called Antoinette and
Antoinette Cosway. Gives her a voice. And I think there's lots of gaps and spaces in Jane Eyre. And I mean, I said this to you in the first episode that we did. I read Jane Eyre and I felt that there was something missing. And when I read Wide Sargasso Sea, that's what I was like, yes, this is what is missing from the text. And it's interesting that Charlotte Bronte also recognized that. But the idea of moral insanity is also really interesting, because I think it came from James Carroll Pritchard's, who wrote a text on insanity that the Brontes had. So Charlotte Bronte would have been very familiar with this, and the way that Bertha is written kind of matches up quite well with Pritchard's kinds of discussions and descriptions of moral insanity, and the idea that it can be inherited, and that somebody can appear fine and then maybe gradually kind of degenerate into insanity, and that sometimes they might appear to have their faculties, but they are still mad. So that kind of matches up. But what's also really interesting about Pritchard is he also wrote about kind of racial sciences and evolution, and that kind of idea of the idea that was kind of developing in this century about evolution, and the idea of the human species developing from there are two strands. So one of them is the eugenic strand, and then one of them is how we understand evolution now. The idea that the human species has a common descendant, and that we've all kind of descended from the same common species ancestor. That's the word. Thank you. So a change from the idea that all the kind of human nationalities and races were kind of put on the earth fully developed, but the idea that humankind has kind of grown from one kind of ancestor, and that all humans are related. And yeah, part of that is the eugenics. He's building on works of Johann Friedrich Blumenbach, who was a kind of German anthropologist in the 18th century, who developed all of these kind of pseudo-racist kind of ideas about there are five categories of race. And Pritchard agreed with that, and especially the idea of inherited characteristics, and the idea that yes, we've all come from this one common ancestor, but that specific character traits can be passed on and developed, and then inherited, which kind of links up with his ideas of psychiatry, and the idea that, you know, moral insanity can be passed on. So it's kind of interesting that Bronte gets her ideas about madness from him, and it kind of links with those kinds of racial anxieties as well, in terms of what's inherited and those kinds of anxieties and issues.
The and we get that a little bit, that not only that inheriting that madness, but that it's so corrupting, and that there are you know, people that will bring that into your, especially the, you know, the good British, you know, aristocratic family, and they will affect your blue blood.
Exactly, that's where the eugenics idea comes from, and the idea of contaminated bloodlines. He'll
start talking about that in a bit, but we're a quarter way through this. My God, we're never going to get through everything. But it's a long chapter. But we're at the point where, again, he says, now you are to share my solitude. Do you understand? And she's like, you know, and she doesn't say anything. And then it's just like, this is the definition of mansplaining, right? Jane, will you hear reason? And then he backs it up with a threat too, because if you won't, I'll try violence. And she looks at him, and he looks like he is in this moment of frenzy here, she calls it. With one impetus of frenzy more, I should be able to do nothing with him. And he does, you know, and her response is to, I took hold of his clenched hand, loosened the contorted fingers, and said to him soothingly, sit down, I'll talk as long as you like. I mean, this kind of Beauty and the Beast moment that happens here in a bit, that she sees he's about to go off the rails, and I'll settle him down by taking his hands and telling him to calm down. There's also a question from Adam too, that, you know, that is really troubling about this part, and that in that same paragraph, it's more than just a threat of physical violence. It's a threat of sexual violence, you know, like, and he seems to do that all through this whole exchange that they have here.
He does it the entire time, not just in this section, but, you know, from the minute that they meet, because he's aligned with this Gothic figure, you know, from the minute that he appears, and she, you know, it's a little bit childish on Jane's part because she's indulging in that imagination, but from the moment he appears, this sexual threat that he comes with, is he the Gothic villain or is he the Gothic hero?
That's a question I want to ask.
What does that mean? And I think that this is the moment where it's like, oh, this is a young woman who lives in the house of a man. You know, there's a French servant, there's a young girl, there's an elderly housekeeper. How protected is she? You know, where does the line draw? You know, what is the reality of this situation? And I think the threat of it's not been a threat of sexual violence up until this point. It's been almost like a potential. It's part of the allure and the attraction. And then in this moment, it's that realization that she is in a very vulnerable position, and that her social status means that it's not like you can criticize her for putting herself in that position. It's the only way that she can make a living. Is to put herself in these situations where she's in these types of households.
Yeah. Her response is just as troubling, though, because the crisis was perilous, but not without its charm, such as the Indian perhaps feels when he slips over the rapid in his canoe, that it's a bit thrilling for her to be in this situation. And she acknowledges that, but that's troubling. Or is that far more troubling for, you know, for a modern audience that has no, you know, like we don't, there's no place for this, and this shouldn't be happening. And while she's still in this world where it does happen, and she has to deal with it.
So here's the question as well, is that when the heroine of a text is attracted to the like sublimity and the masculinity of the villain, what does that say and what does that mean? And we could go really in depth, and we could, you know, there's been lots of studies done about female sexual fantasies and how, you know, so many of them are about things like kidnap and, you know, these really seemingly on the surface troubling ideas. Part of that is because as a patriarchal society and a historically patriarchal society, how do you interpret sexual desire? Because where does your agency in that sexual interaction come from? To an extent, we, of course, you know, it's troubling, not because of Jane as a character or necessarily that she finds that attractive, but because of what it says about the situation. Jane, in this moment, realizes that she has a lot of power over, as much as he could have physical power over her. She, at this moment, basically says to us as the reader, I recognize that I have this power over him because my decision and my words and my choice is, you know, that's what's going to shape what happens here. And there is, between two people who are attracted to each other, of course, a sexual thrill there. And I think, again, this is one of those moments where Bronte is challenging our idealistic understandings. You know, we don't want to ever, like, the readers don't want to acknowledge that the heroine is attracted to the villain, you know. And it goes back to things like The Changeling, which is, I cannot remember off the top of my head who the play is written by, but it's a Jacobean play. And the lead character, the female character, is attracted to this male character who's described as being disfigured and hunched, and because he's so, you know, scheming and Machiavellian, and he matches her on an intellectual level. So we have this long literary tradition of these kind of sympathy for the devil, you know, attracting to the enemy, you know, and you know, look at how fanfic works. We see ourselves doing this over and over again, but I think it is troubling, and we should dip into it. But I think we have to be really careful about how we discuss these moments, because what we don't want to do is to feed into a narrative of demonizing sexual desire and sexual arousal in women, and trying to navigate that within a system that, you know, doesn't give much freedom. How do you identify your desires when your desires are not presented to you? There's nothing to identify with. So I do think, yes, it is troubling, more troubling to a modern reader, but we have to really be careful about how we talk about this, because it's so easy to be like, oh no, that's toxic. Like, write that off. That's not that's not okay. That's not sexy at all. Like, no. But actually, like, the thing that is troubling about it is kind of on a completely different wavelength, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. It does. And then we get, like, in his story, he gets to talk about all of his desire, but we're not allowed to talk about Jane's. And you know, and we get we get a lot of Jane thinking about her passion and how she feels and her desires, but not in the same way that we get Rochester in this. So it's not allowed. And we're in a world that it's not allowed. Literally, like this entire world here, author, publishing, the characters themselves. This isn't allowed.
I mean, Mary can probably comment on this because you've worked a lot more than I have on Zafloya, but there's not really any language to talk about female sexuality or female desire at this point in time that doesn't render it monstrous or immoral.
Like
there
Bertha.
is no
like Bertha.
there is no language.
I was going to say that kind of contrast where you have almost an absence with Jane of her kind of sexual desire. You have to read between the lines or see the empty spaces that she doesn't include in the text. But obviously Rochester recounts his interactions with Bertha. I mean, we're almost there. But the idea that she's enjoying herself, and part of that is, sexual enjoyment and sexual desire, and the fact that she's out at these parties and dancing and having fun and enjoying all this male attention. And that's part of what makes her monstrous. And I think especially when you do look at kind of post-colonial narratives and kind of racial anxieties in terms of Bertha, that's one of the things that I think you can read Bertha alongside these other non-white women. Zafloya, who is where you have a female desire for a black man, but then also later with The Blood of the Vampire, where you have another kind of Creole monstrous woman who is a vampire and comes from kind of former colonies and from a plantation. Her racial heritage is also kind of a bit mixed, and therefore from a British perspective monstrous and potentially dangerous, and that's exactly how Rochester presents Bertha, and it's like, this is bad and this is monstrous. That idea that black women, that Creole women, any women that weren't deemed to be white, were incredibly masculine. They were often quite large, tall, strong-willed, often quite physically violent, and had a massive appetite, so both for food but also for sex. And you do see little bits of that in the kind of Bertha's description.
Oh, we see a lot of that in her description. That's how he describes her, big time. I mean, and he goes on to tell her story now, or his story, and it's of course how everyone can, and in a nutshell, everyone conspired against me to marry a beautiful rich woman. He tried for about 4 years, but her behavior was so repulsive to him that he just couldn't stand it. Then his father and brother died, and now he doesn't even need Bertha's money, so he's kind of free. But her insanity, he says, was the thing that tipped the real tip the scales for him. Like, now he's dishonored and he's trapped, and he's 26 years old, and so he leaves and goes on his whirlwind tour of, not debauchery, because he's not into debauchery, he says. Marianne pointed out, I tried dissipation, never debauchery. That I hated. And Marianne says, what's the difference? Can someone address this, please? In a minute, I think. I mean,
I can answer that.
Yeah, in a minute we will. But in the text here, he says, before I get there, I just want to talk about her madness and how that affects him in a way that this is a very 19th century, aristocratic. I mean, I know he's not related to the royals, but that kind of upper class way of how they view it. One of the reasons he's talking about when he's marrying her is that I was of a good race, he says. So, I mean, it's literally that, and it's not, I think today we just think too much in particular skin colors. It is far more, specific to him in this way, that Creole, even if she's of a white, European family, they're Creole, they're still others. They're still not of his race.
Yeah. So there isn't a, oh, sorry.
I was just say there's a class element, there's a nationality element, but yeah, Mary.
I was just going to say, so Creole, there's lots of different kinds of uses of that term, and it doesn't necessarily mean black. So you can, for example, be a white Creole, and I think that's some of the suggestions or some of the readings for Bertha, the fact that she comes from a kind of planter family, so somebody who would have owned a plantation and therefore owned slaves. And obviously anyone who knows anything about kind of American history and British history and enslaved people, is that often what owners of plantations did was they raped the women that were enslaved on their plantation. So there's always that kind of possibility there that their offspring may or may not be pure. So you get, Rochester uses this term a lot, not just I was of a good race, which is therefore implying that Bertha isn't, but that there is an impurity about her that there isn't about him. But even just in terms of the fact that the place, the kind of physicality of the place also has a kind of racial anxiety of itself. It's hot, the weather, the kind of the heat, the air. He describes it as sulfurous at some point, and the idea that the place, potentially all of these British merchants and plantation owners have gone over, and they've been contaminated by the place. So even white Creole families were therefore contaminated by this kind of exotic foreign place, and coming back into British society, they're not the same, they are other. But I think, yeah, the idea of reading Bertha as kind of, especially in terms of her insanity, that links to that kind of place and her potential racial anxiety. I mean, whiteness as a construct is just that, it's a construct, and it's built on the constructions of boundaries between the self and the other, but they're always constantly being negotiated and constantly being challenged. And a lot of times whiteness is conditional, and that's where these kind of class structures come in. And what is considered white today, it was completely different in the 20th century, where, for example, Italians might not have been considered white, and it would have been completely different in the 19th century, where you have a lot of Creole people, specifically coming from the British Empire or in the British Empire. The idea of, are Creole people white? Can we consider them white? Are they considered white? And how does that affect our kind of British lineage? And then going back to like the 18th century, even these ideas of race, like I said, Blumenbach's ideas, he's quite a kind of seminal writer in these kinds of pseudo-racist theories, but that's from the 18th century. Our conceptions of race are constantly changing and constantly evolving, because they're constantly being negotiated around this idea of what is whiteness.
And it's so much to do with the idea of socialization, and writers like Pritchard and Blumenbach are also dealing with the writings of people like Erasmus Darwin and even Maria Edgeworth, the ideas about class and behavior and excess. Excess is such a huge issue in the 18th century. The revolution is often demonized through excess. Napoleon is demonized through excess. France as a nation was demonized through excess, and then that spreads. So particularly Creole culture is often kind of painted with this idea of like negativity because it's too hot and it's too far away, and there's this massive anxiety about when you're an empire, where does the border lie? Are the people within your empire British, and therefore are they white? And one of the things that you get with a character like Bertha, and White Sock SOC picks up on this really well, is that anxiety of socialization with not only Black people, with poor people, with slaves, with the wrong kind of white people, with the Spanish, with the French, and that through that, this is huge anxiety at this point in time about Italy and about the excess of Italy. And you get it in writers like Wilkie Collins. Spain has a similar representation. She is too close to those things, and it's implied that whether she is white Creole, whether she is mixed Creole, whether she is of uncertain racial origin, her identity as a member of this nation is inherently problematic because it's too much of a melting pot. It's too hot. It's too excessive, and yeah, I can talk about this a little bit more. It depends if we want to answer the debauchery and dissipation question now, but it's interesting that Rochester says that. Yeah,
he says that I could not rib myself up. Well, I was going to say, and then we'll lead the divorce and then the madness thing, because not only is the race, but now it's also the madness thing is also another contaminant, another thing that makes someone other. And I want to get into that in a little bit, but the first, he says, I could not rid myself of it by any legal proceedings. The marriage, he means, for the doctors now discovered that my wife was mad. So, and I think that is a lot of people reading this novel now thinking like, well, locked her up. Why didn't he divorce her? Why don't, get some kind of legal separation? Well, he can't. It is especially if your wife goes mad, that's it. Like there's definitely no divorce in the law then.
And that lasts for a really long time.
Yeah.
Like if you guys have seen Downton Abbey, which is obviously set in the 10s, 20s, 30s, one of the characters wants to get married to this guy, and it turns out he has a wife who is in an asylum, and because she's in an asylum, he can't divorce her, and that means they can't get married. So, we're talking a couple of 100 years, up until what we would consider a modern period, that was part of marital law. Sorry, Mary, I cut you off.
One of the few grounds for divorce was adultery, and obviously the insanity ruling means that there's no way that anyone's going to rule on that. But he had 4 years with her in Jamaica, in Spanish Town, and you have to think what he must have been enjoying himself to some extent, or how long did it take him to seek out this kind of divorce idea? Because the timeline, it's been 15 years. I think there's that idea that
10 years.
She spent 10 years in the attic.
Yeah.
And I presume it's
10 years. Jesus.
And I think he says that his father dies, is it after 4 or 5 years? But there's that kind of period, isn't it?
They're in Jamaica for 4 years, and then they have a year in England.
Yeah, and I think it's in that
she's supposed to deteriorate in that year.
Yeah. But it makes you think, what was happening in those 4 years, and was there nothing that kind of, did she not commit adultery? Did he not? It's interesting. There's so much. This is such a big period of time, and even just that 5 years before she's locked up. Yeah. What we're getting in this chapter, and this chapter is quite long and very dense, but there's so much that is obviously missing that he's not sharing with us. It's a long time.
He says that too about the madness too. Now in the eyes of the world, I was doubtless covered with grimy dishonor, and so his answer is to lock her up and then go is to flee. And I'm just going to run around.
It's also that discussion of impurity and dirt and griminess, which implies a non-cleanliness, but that idea of, even in kind of metaphorical language, the association with darkness, with kind of sin and transgression, and not being clean and not being pure, which is, I saw a comment about Blanche. That's the whole idea. Blanche is described as dark, whereas Jane is fair, because you have that kind of metaphorical idea of colors as well, that then is kind of put into racial kind of structures and class structures, and our ideas of mental illness.
This part also I noticed this time that the reason for the secrecy then is I think is tied to this dishonor, that it's more than just hiding his wife so he can go out and live as he wants. It's also the kind of proper response of the upper classes. Because madness is degrading, and it's doubly so here because she's Creole, then it literally lessens his status in the ruling class. So as a ruling class gentleman, it's almost like it's my duty to lock her away and keep it a secret, so that doesn't affect not just my lifestyle, but the power that I have to live my life in the class that I want to live it in.
And this is where you get the manly energy thing again, because this is where it gets a little bit complicated. And when we do have to take a step back from our contemporary perspective. Now, this isn't to say that we shouldn't judge him harshly for what he does, because I'm a firm believer in you read through context, but modern theory should still inform. But what he's also saying is, I have a responsibility. My father and brother may be dead. I may be one of the only members of my family, but we know that Mrs. Fairfax is a distant cousin. He has estates. There are people who live on those estates. There are people who rent those houses. We assume, because it's 1847, and this text is obviously set prior to that, because Jane is young, and so we're probably looking early 1800s at some point. As a landowner, as a member of the upper class, he has a responsibility to husbandry. So there is this element of, if this becomes known about me, all of these people who rely on me, and the name and the legacy and the lineage and everything that goes with it, not just as a point of pride, but as a little ecosystem, falls apart. People aren't going to want to work for me or live on my lands, because they might not be able to get jobs elsewhere, or it might, it's not just, and this is the whole, again, dissipation, debauchery thing. It's not just about him and his lifestyle. It's about the fact that he is Mr. Rochester, and he has all of this responsibility. And he kind of defends himself a little bit. He's not entirely reprehensible, because he also says, if I'd have put Bertha in an asylum, essentially, she would have, we know that, sanatoriums and asylums were absolutely horrendous. He shows an awareness of not only would it be degrading for me and for everybody who lives under me, who I'm responsible for, it would have been degrading for her. And as much as he perceives her as monstrous and he says he hates her, he's like, I wasn't going to do that to her. So this is where you get that kind of, it's difficult for us sometimes to read this bit, because it comes across as arrogance and unwillingness to sacrifice his lifestyle. But the reality is, there's something absolutely huge underneath it, and something that the country is still recovering from, having had this 20-30 years of rakish debauchery, where all of these young men post-restoration, frittered away their family money, and destroying your family name and household and income doesn't just ruin the 8 people who are in your upper class family, it ruins all of the people who are tenants and in that society and do business and X, Y, and Z, because we have this very internalized kind of economic, ecological system at this point in time. So yeah, that's the only thing to just kind of keep in mind here.
At the risk of justifying his behavior.
Yeah, I don't want to let it off.
It is a moment of context. It is a moment of,
yeah, it's an important context to keep in mind, that actually, like, the way he does it is still abhorrent, but the reason that it's again the manly energy thing. His like the actual action, you're like, you idiot, why are you like this? But the reason that he thinks he needs to do it, he is fulfilling that duty. Like, he could have chosen something far less impactful on himself, like, locking her up in Jamaica, or there's other things he could have done that he doesn't do. So there is an element that
and he also
is being a being person.
He woos Jane and keeps it a secret. That's completely separate from this, and that's the issue. He never really addresses, and which is the worst thing. All right, I'm gonna just because we have to get through the rest of the chapter. One more thing about Rochester, and then I want to focus on Jane's response at the end, and then how she leaves. The one more thing about Rochester is, and this is about halfway in, he talks about He says, it appeared to me so absolutely rational that I should be considered free to love and be loved. And then I want to go out and find someone that I want to be in love with. Now, from a very modern perspective, it's like, yeah, that is true. That's a very true thing to believe in. Of course, everything he does like just kind of messes it up. But that kind of statement then again throws him into the Gothic hero and the romantic love interest. And I love this idea that in this chapter especially, I'm constantly thrown between, wait a minute, are you a Gothic villain or are you a Gothic hero? And it almost makes me think like Charlotte Bronte, like Milton once upon a time, could have been at a Devil's Party and not known it, like that she's kind of casting him as this romantic hero, but she's really talking about all his villainy. And that's my question. Is he not a Gothic villain?
So to answer the dissipation debauchery question, because this is actually really important, is the difference.
There you go.
Dissipation is about inaction. Dissipation is the idea of dissipation in the 18th and 19th century is about kind of like just not fulfilling, not doing. It's a kind of not necessarily laziness, but kind of like allowing yourself to just be swept along. Debauchery is specifically about excess and seeking excess. So one can be dissipated and kind of like squander and kind of fall into this kind of cycle. And Gothic heroes do this. When the Gothic heroes, because they're very passionate, they have intense sensibility, they often are misled into dissipation. Debauchery is rakishness. Debauchery is the active pursuit of an aggressive, excessive masculinity. So this is that like Sardian, libertine, Wilmot kind of like aggressive pursuit of debauchery. So debauchery is that kind of like, I am going to go out and I am going to do these things. Whereas dissipation is this kind of romantic languor of kind of like, I'm very sad. Terrible things have happened to me and I'm drinking in the bar and it just so happens that people offer me drugs and I can pay people for sex. It's that kind of like almost tragic. And I'm trying not to sound super sarcastic because I think it's absolute crap. But there's this in the eyes of a 18th and 19th century morality is two very different things. The rake is by this point irredeemable, but the romantic lost lamb, so to speak, is. And Rochester very specifically falls into the dissipation category. He has the potential to do the other, but him saying like, I acknowledge that difference means he straddles that border very consciously between hero and villain. And of course we are post-Byronic here. So he becomes more of the kind of, the tortured romantic hero rather than the Gothic villain or the Gothic hero. But yeah, dissipation and the idea of dissipation is more about that kind of like that tragic fall rather than the sort of active villainy. And I saw someone say, what's John Reed? John Reed is debauched.
Yeah, he
pursues
clearly,
these things. Rochester falls into this because he's in a tragic situation, which, to be fair to him, there is an element I can kind of, be like, yeah, it is kind of tragic. And you get this a lot in the 19th century, this dissipation. But yeah, dissipation is a very different state of being to debauchery. And that's why I kind of reticently identify him as a Gothic villain, because he doesn't fully fit that category, because he starts to, the danger is that when he gets Jane, he starts to demonstrate that actually he probably could be a Gothic villain, because now he has something that he's willing to, he's like, oh, but I want this person, like I want this life. I'm going to do all these terrible things, like trick a woman into marrying me, which is literally what the Gothic villain does.
Yeah.
But it's kind of, it's that more complicated.
In the chat, Janet put the violins there. Like we're all,
Yeah.
like, oh, sorry, Rochester. Sorry, you're 26, enormously rich and powerful, and are stuck with a woman that you could take care of and then go lead your life.
Yeah, it's very much this kind of romantic, like man of feeling, kind of post Enlightenment. Isn't society so terrible because society is restrictive? And it's kind of like what Radcliffe says with Valancourt. It's like, oh, well, this is society's fault because the society of Paris is so awful and so debauched and so, only bothered about appearance and all these things and blah, blah, blah. It's not his fault, essentially. Like, he has to own up to it, but we have to forgive him because he's a victim of the society. So it's kind of that thing of like, to put it in modern terms, it's the patriarchy harms men too argument. We don't deny that patriarchy harms men too, but it doesn't mean we forgive all the terrible things that people do because of the patriarchy.
Yeah. Mary, is he a Gothic villain?
I think he's a flawed anti-hero villain. I mean, I guess it depends. Like Lauren said, that there's two ways to read this text. One is kind of in the kind of context of when it was written and published, and then also there's our modern interpretation. And I think seeing him as a lost little lamb works for both. In the one sense, yes, he's a flawed villain, but in the modern sense, he's just a bit of a.
I love the way you phrase that too, because that's what he says Jane is at one point. Like she's the lost lamb and he's the shepherd. And he's always doing that. He's always turning it around.
Mm-hmm.
But actually, what's really interesting about when I was rereading this chapter, what I thought was the way that there are echoes between Jane and Rochester. Rochester is tricked into marriage, and he doesn't have all the facts, and he can't undertake that marriage with his full kind of faculties. So there is something tragic there because he is tricked and therefore lost little lamb. But it's the same with Jane. She doesn't, the marriage could never happen legally, religiously.
They wouldn't have been married.
It wouldn't have been married, but they could have pretended.
But she would have lost all her status. Because,
and she again would have been tricked
and had no legal right.
But I don't know what's worse, having all of your friends and family trick you into marrying someone, and the marriage was already kind of set up before he went out to Jamaica, or what happens with Jane, where it's just Rochester pulling all the strings. And I think our kind of modern interpretation of the text.
I can unequivocally, it's worse. And I think it's worse in the novel. I think Jane knows that, and everybody reading the novel knows that that's worse. What he is.
And that's why she has to leave. Like, she recognizes, as we recognize as readers, that he is not unforgivable. We understand the reasons that he's done what he's done, but the fact that he doesn't understand why.
And
because he gets mad at her, doesn't he? And he's like, I'm not married, why can't you see this? Like, I don't have a wife, I've not done anything wrong. And she's like, yeah, you need to get over that.
but it's exactly that. His whole tale of woe is me, is about being tricked into this marriage. And you'd think he'd at least be able to understand that Jane might also have some feelings about the fact that she was almost tricked into a sham marriage, but he just has no kind of self-reflection or awareness. It's all about himself.
Good. Yeah, let's get to Jane. But that also is he tells the story of meeting Jane, and he tells it like a fairy story. We already know that. He also confirms that he's always been observing her and she hasn't really noticed, that he was from the very beginning. They have this kind of very interesting exchange here where it's like this reverse marriage ceremony where, like, you mean to go away? I do. You mean to go now? I do. And like where the I do's are not the, and she's it would not be wicked to love me, it would to obey you. I mean, exactly the opposite of what you're supposed to be saying in the marriage ceremony. And Jane rejects him, and he said, how could you do that? And then he pulls the I'm gonna suffer card, and then she gets back to the Helen Burns lesson of the doctrine of endurance. We were born to strive and endure, you as well as I. Her answer is tough shit. You just got to deal with it. You're married to a mad woman and you have to make the best of your situation. And he can't accept that. She just comfort him then before she leaves. And this is the compassionate Jane. And she even goes to leave and comes back. I had already gained the door, towards the end here, but and again, she brings us into this again, the other moment that she brings us into it in this chapter. But reader, I walked back as determinedly as I had retreated. I knelt down by him. I turned his face from the cushion to me. I kissed his cheek. I smoothed his hair with my hand. God bless you, my dear master. She gives him a moment of comfort there that for me does nothing but amplify what he doesn't do, not just to Jane, because he's still suffering like, oh, it's all about me, but he also didn't do to his mad wife. He'd never recognized that. This is one of the things she called him out on earlier, is like, why didn't you show more sympathy? And now she's showing him, this is what you're supposed to do. When somebody acts insane, like you are doing, all the way she describes his face and the frenzy and the way his actions are, he is insane in this chapter. And she's trying to get him to realize that this is how you're supposed to treat people who go over the edge. And now Jane, and now she's alone in her room, realizing she has to leave. And she dreams of the Red Room. Which is that moment comes back to her, that this moment of supreme loneliness, desolation that she experienced as a child comes back to her, but it's different this time. That paragraph there, the roof resolved to cloud, like she's dreaming she's in the Red Room, but then it's clouds and then the moon. And then do you have that moment, one of you, where she broke forth as never moon yet? You see that moment halfway through that night paragraph? Can you read that? Either Mary or Lauren. It's the paragraph that I never thought to sleep. That night I never thought to sleep. And then the moon breaks in and she has this right towards the end, like the last page.
Yeah. Have you found it, Lauren, or shall I read it?
You go.
Go ahead.
It's after some asterisks.
Yeah.
Do you want the whole paragraph or from she broke?
No,
forth?
just like she broke forth.
Just found it.
Oh, you read it then.
That night I never thought to sleep.
Yeah, read like halfway down there. She broke forth as never moon yet.
Got it there. She broke forth as never moon yet burst from cloud. A hand first penetrated the sable folds and waved him away. Then not a moon, but a white human form shone in the azure, inclining a glorious brow earthward. It gazed and gazed on me. It spoke to my spirit. Immeasurably distant was the tone, yet so near, it whispered in my heart. My daughter, flee temptation. Mother, I will. So I answered after I had waked from the trance-like dream.
Yeah, we could stop there. But I love this moment where she's in her dream, she's in the Red Room, but now it's all going to transform in a way that reminds me of her watercolor paintings that I'm fascinated with. This kind of scene with the moon coming down and it's a woman who's, helping her and it's her mother, or she imagines her to be. But in this novel, and the way dreams happen in this novel, this is a real thing. Like, I think that in her world, in Charlotte Bronte's world, this is real, that her mother really is talking to her at this moment in this. Finally, someone will come in and say, you have to do this, but it has to happen in a dream and someone from outside. And that's her choice. Her choice is to, I'm just gonna skedaddle without anybody knowing, in secret. Melissa had quoted very earlier here, commented, I agree with her leaving, but not in the unsafe way she did it. Couldn't she still have refused him and yet demanded her wages and left? You know, I think
not really.
She's had her last conversation with him.
He might have stopped her from leaving. And I think that is, you know, there's the implication, or, you know, we can perhaps think that maybe she won't be strong enough tomorrow. She has to leave now. Well, she has the will and the resolution. But there's also the idea, you know, they've kind of been going a bit backwards and forwards in their conversation with his violence, and that idea that he could potentially become violent or, you know, restrain her. And, you know, here in her dream, she's going back to a point in her childhood when she, you know, a traumatic event in her childhood where she was trapped in a room. And that's essentially what's happened to Bertha. Bertha is the wife of Rochester, and she is trapped and locked in a room, and she has no agency and she cannot escape. And I think there's that idea that in order to break out, to break free, to not be trapped in her own red room or in her own attic room, that she has to leave now. It's both that it's making like tangible the very real threats that Jane is not safe here. There's not a lot of people here, and Mr. Rochester is in full control over everyone.
She also soon after that again says, I long to be his. I panted to return. It was not too late. Like, she still has that to deal with. So I'm certain she can't have another meeting with him, that she not recognizes that she is still too tempted by this, and she has to make this decision for herself. And
it kind of hammers home like the situation, because I think I talked about this before. In Pamela, she goes to leave and she sees, oh, this bit always makes me laugh so much. She sees what she thinks is a bull in the field, and she says it's like Satan, and Mr. B is communing with the bull to prevent her from leaving. She wakes up in the morning and it's a cow, like like she was in no danger whatsoever. But, you know, often in the Gothic novel, the heroine has to just run.
Yeah.
She has to take the moment and run. And the point is that, you know, it's to highlight the general vulnerability and unsafeness of being a woman in these periods of time, that one is unsafe in the house and one is unsafe outside of the house. And ultimately what you have to do is decide which situation you can manage as an individual. And you know, in this case, and in many cases in these novels, it's a case of fleeing. They put up with it to a certain amount, and then when something happens, they realize they have to run. Like, they cannot stay here any longer. And that essentially is what Jane is doing. She's continuing this tradition of, you know, and what's interesting here is there's a personal element. Not only is she in danger, she's in danger of being swayed. She's in danger of believing it too, and of you know, remaining in the bubble and thinking it's okay. So she has to go without saying goodbye. She has to go without getting her wages. And it is obviously does then heighten the tension and the drama, but it also brings light to the fact that even if she's, you know, if she stays and tries to get her wages, she's putting herself in as much danger as not, essentially.
Yeah. Maureen mentioned in the chat there that she is a bird quote, and that is precisely true with this. That this is what Jane has said, and this is what she needs to do. There's no net is going to ensnare her. She has to leave. That is, you know, to be herself. And she takes a little bit of money, and then 20, and then she gets on the coach, and he says 30. Is that real, or is he, you know, tricking her out of all her money? I'm thinking like 30 shillings for a coach
30
ride.
Shillings.
I don't know, but you know, I don't know if she was, you know, tricked out of this, or I tried to look up a quick answer, but I couldn't find one. But in any case, it is she will, you know, she'll be penniless. And then at the very end,
240 pence was a pound, roughly. So potentially a little bit. I'm decent with pounds, but once it gets to pence and shillings, I'm like,
I don't know. I just wonder if this coachman doesn't look at her and say like, yeah, I'm going to take you for 30 shillings because you look like.
I guess she doesn't have the luxury of choice or the experience to barter.
But she gets on the coach, and then again we get the finished chapter. We get again addressing the reader, gentle reader, may you never feel what I then felt. And she brings us back into this, in case you forgot, because of how abominably, Rochester behaved, she is completely in love with him. And this is the choice she's making, is not just to go and flee and be free and on my own and I'm independent. It's also, I have to give up the thing that I most wanted. For never may you, like me, dread to be the instrument of evil to what you wholly love. Which is a take on then with something that she'll say later. Then she'll come back to that later. Then that's where I've adapted the quote that I end every show with. So, all right, we went way over. And we could have gone a whole nother hour talking about everything.
It was
else.
A long chapter.
It was. And I knew it was going to be tough to get through it all. And so I had to jump ahead at one point. Just like, he said this. Let's go to the end. And then everybody couldn't find where we are. But yeah, that's it. So we get an appeal to the reader at the end. Well, Bronte Swords and Airheads, thank you all for tuning in today. We'll post this recording on our website, and it's available on our YouTube page. And if that's how you're watching for the first time, thanks for watching. We have a Sundays with Jane Eyre Facebook group where we continue the conversation. Look us up on Facebook and join in that conversation. But also go to our YouTube channel and like the Jane Eyre videos and subscribe to the channel for the Rosenbach and leave comments there as well. Thank you, Brianna, who was our chat, Mrs. Fairfax, returning today. Thanks, Brianna, for managing the links. Next week on episode 21, our friend Dr. Kathleen Hudson returns to talk about volume 3, chapter 2, or chapter 28, in which Jane has fled Thornfield and winds up begging in Whitecross and is rescued by the Rivers family. And we meet St. John Rivers. So is there a team St. John? Is there a team St. John?
I would like it on record that St. John is the absolute worst.
There's no team St. John.
I second that.
Mary and I were like, oh, what chapter are we? Oh my God. Oh God, have we got to talk about St. John's introduction? And then when we realized it was this chapter, we were like, yes. Good.
Yeah. All right. You were spared St. John. Well, you'll come back to him, I think. You'll have one chapter with him later.
I'm in a stupid name.
Everyone, if you're looking for more virtual engagement, head on over to the Rosenbach website. Check out the other virtual offerings we have. The Rosenbach is also open to visit. See our website for how we're making it safe for you to come see our exhibitions and historic house in person. And please support the Rosenbach, which you can do by donation or becoming a member. Any donation is welcome. Membership is great too. I invite you to join. Mary and Lauren, thank you. Great to go through this chapter with you. In a perfect world, we would have done it in 2 shows, but this is,
next time.
We got through a lot today. Playing us out over the credits, everyone, will be the Pleated Gazelle song Secrets. Farewell, readers. May you live entirely for and with what you love best on earth. Bye-bye, everyone.